$3.4 billion. That is how much it cost American taxpayers to clean up one man's savings and loan. And 23,000 ordinary people lost their retirement money to bonds they were told were as safe as a bank account, because they were standing inside a bank when they bought them. Charles Keating grew up in Cincinnati, swam competitively in college, and spent decades building a reputation as a fierce, Catholic, anti-obscenity crusader who once hired the FBI's top pornography investigator to help him wage culture war. He wasn't the kind of man you expected to find at the center of the largest savings and loan failure in American history. But by the mid-1980s, Keating had reinvented himself entirely. He was the chairman of American Continental Corporation, a real estate developer headquartered in Phoenix, and in 1984, he purchased Lincoln Savings and Loan Association of Irvine, California, for $51 million. That purchase would eventually cost everyone else 67 times that amount. Savings and loans, sometimes called thrifts, existed for a simple purpose. Ordinary depositors would put their savings in. The institution would lend that money out as home mortgages, and everyone made a modest, predictable return. The federal government insured those deposits up to a certain limit through the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, which meant that if the institution failed, taxpayers were on the hook. The system worked as long as thrift stayed boring. Keating had no interest in boring. In the early 1980s, Congress deregulated the savings and loan industry, allowing thrifts to move into riskier investments, commercial real estate, junk bonds, direct equity stakes in business ventures. For a man like Keating, this wasn't a regulatory change. It was an invitation. He moved Lincoln's deposit base, money belonging to retirees and working families throughout California, into a vast portfolio of speculative real estate projects in the Arizona desert. Hotels, golf courses, land developments with names that sounded like promises. The assets on the books looked impressive. Whether they were actually worth what Lincoln said they were worth was a different question entirely. But here is where it gets genuinely audacious. American Continental Corporation, Keating's parent company, sold bonds directly to the public, not insured government bonds, not certificates of deposit, but subordinated debentures, high-yield instruments that stood last in line if anything went wrong. Lincoln Savings branches across California became the primary distribution channel. Customers walked in to renew a CD and walked out holding something else entirely. Tellers and branch employees, some of whom allegedly received bonuses tied to bond sales volume, steered customers toward the American Continental bonds. The pitch, according to later testimony, sometimes included the suggestion that these bonds were just as safe as the insured deposits sitting in the next window. They were not. They were not insured by anyone. If American Continental failed, bondholders had essentially nothing. 23,000 people purchased approximately $250 million of those bonds. Many of them were elderly. Many believed, until the very end, that their money was federally protected. The federal regulators noticed. In 1986, examiners from the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco began looking closely at Lincoln's books. What they found alarmed them: questionable appraisals on real estate assets, transactions that appeared to inflate the value of properties, an institution that looked profitable on paper, but whose underlying assets were increasingly difficult to value with confidence. The examiners recommended that Lincoln be seized. That recommendation was sent up the chain, and then something unusual happened. It stalled. In April 1987, 5 United States senators met privately with federal regulators on Keating's behalf. The meeting wasn't secret at the time in the sense that it happened. These things get around in Washington. but its full implications wouldn't become clear for years. The 5 senators were Alan Cranston of California, Dennis DeConcini of Arizona, John Glenn of Ohio, John McCain of Arizona, and Donald Regal of Michigan. Together, they had received a total of $1.3 million in campaign contributions from Keating and his associates. Keating had not been subtle about the transaction. When asked later whether he believed his contributions bought political influence, he said, according to widely reported accounts, that he certainly hoped so. The senators pushed the regulators. The examination was transferred from San Francisco to Washington. Lincoln was allowed to continue operating. The bleeding continued for 2 more years. By 1989, the losses had grown beyond any possibility of concealment. On April 13, 1989, American Continental Corporation filed for bankruptcy. The next day, federal regulators seized Lincoln savings. The timing meant that the bankruptcy filing came first, which immediately halted interest payments to the American Continental bondholders. 23,000 people showed up at Lincoln branches that week. Some of them had their entire retirement savings in those bonds. They were told the branches were closed. The money was gone. All of it. The cleanup cost was staggering. The Resolution Trust Corporation, the entity Congress created specifically to manage the savings and loan crisis, eventually determined that the Lincoln savings failure alone would cost taxpayers $3.4 billion. That made it the single most expensive savings and loan failure in the entire crisis, a crisis that itself ultimately cost American taxpayers somewhere between $150 and $200 billion across more than 1,000 failed institutions. Lincoln was the crown jewel of the catastrophe. Keating was arrested in 1990. He was convicted in California State Court in 1991 on 17 counts of securities fraud, sentenced to 10 years. He was then convicted in federal court in 1993 on 73 counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and fraud, sentenced to 12 years and 5 months. He served 4.5 years before both convictions were vacated on procedural grounds related to jury instructions. In 1999, rather than face a third trial, Keating pleaded guilty in federal court to 4 counts of bankruptcy fraud and wire fraud. He was sentenced to time served. He walked out of court a free man. He died in 2014 at the age of 90. The 5 senators fared better than the bondholders, but worse than Keating. The Senate Ethics Committee investigated and found that DeConcini and Cranston had acted improperly, with Cranston receiving a formal reprimand, the harshest public rebuke the committee issued. The others received varying degrees of criticism, but no formal sanction. All 5 saw their political careers damaged in ways that ranged from significant to terminal. DeConcini didn't seek re-election. Cranston retired. Regal retired. Glenn lost a presidential primary badly. McCain survived, though the episode followed him for the rest of his career. The committee's conclusion, stated plainly, was that the senators had allowed a major campaign donor to use them as a shield between a failing institution and the regulators trying to close it. The 23,000 bondholders received settlements years later through litigation, recovering pennies on the dollar. For many of them, particularly the elderly customers who had rolled their life savings into those bonds at a branch counter, while a teller told them it was perfectly safe, there was no recovery that mattered. The money had been real. The safety had been a story. What dies first in a collapse like this isn't the money. The money is just the measure. What dies first is the assumption that the person across the counter is constrained by the same rules you're. Keating built his machine on one insight. Most people can't tell the difference between a product that's insured and a product that sounds insured, especially when the person selling it standing inside a building that has the word savings on the sign. The deregulation that enabled the entire savings and loan crisis was itself built on a similar assumption, that institutions freed from restrictions would behave responsibly because responsibility was in their interest. It wasn't. The gap between what Lincoln's savings appeared to be and what it actually was cost $3.4 billion to close. The people who paid that price were the bondholders who believed the pitch, and the taxpayers who never heard it at all.